Welcome to the Sheff United Way. It is once again time for our annual now debrief of the accounts. We're going back to, and I always think it's amazing how long it does take to get the accounts for specific seasons, the 2021-2022 season. Who better to join us than our experts on all things accounts, known sometimes as 𝗟𝗚𝗀𝗀𝗃𝗀 on line. It is Darren Smith. How do you like to introduce yourself, Darren?
You can call me whatever you like, Hal. It's a pleasure to be back on. It seems like a long time. In fact, it's 15 months, actually, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you were to give people your bona fides, why should people listen to you when it comes to accounts?
Well, I am a qualified chartered accountant, and I have been looking at these sort of things for a good few years. But I think it also helps that I'm a bit of a Sheffield United nut, so I probably look at these accounts in more depth than any others that I get paid to look at.
And you've not had long to look at them, but as I say, we are going back to season 21-2022. Before we get to it, I'm going to ask this first question because it's something I've never really asked you before. Why does it take so long to actually get to see these accounts? I'm sure there's some football clubs that would like people never to see these accounts, but why are we talking about the 21-2022 season when actually in reality we're about to start the 23-24 season?
Yeah, so basically all football clubs tend to file their accounts to the year end of June, 30th of June, just because that sort of fits in with the contracts of footballers, and obviously it's season by season. And it's accountancy law, effectively, that you have to file your accounts within 9 months of the year end. So we should actually be having this conversation just after March. And I mean, you can actually file your accounts sooner if you wish, but for some reason nobody ever does. But Sheffield United applied for an extension of 3 months, so that's why we're now even further into the summer than we normally are. And there's no, they don't have to give a reason, but I suspect if you think back to where we were at the end of March, and we still had a certain chap floating around in the background there when in his Tingo airline and things like that, I think it was probably timing not to actually produce the accounts at that point, but maybe delay them until now, until we got some more certainty of where we were going forward. So I think this is probably later than normal, but it's always 9 months after the year end.
Yeah, it feels later than normal. Anyway, we normally feel like we've spoken to you by this point. So let's go with the headlines from these accounts for season 21-2022. Yeah,
so basically, like you say, just to remind ourselves, 21-22 was the first season after relegation. We had 𝗍𝗍𝗶𝗲 that had come in as manager during that summer. Most of the acquisitions were loans. Obviously, the key one was probably Morgan Gibbs White, but we had a Conor Hourihane, we had the Olsen in goal, which didn't quite go as well as we planned. And then we had a few loans through the summer through the winter window after 𝗍𝗍𝗶𝗲 had taken over. We had Charlie Good, we had 𝗍𝗍𝗶𝗲𝗃. The only departure we had, which was a bit of a surprise based on the noise after we were relegated, and obviously a bit of the noise that always surrounds Sander Berge every window, was obviously Aaron Ramsdale to Arsenal. So yeah, so that was the year we're now talking about, and the highlights really were basically the revenue that year was £66.9 million. The expenses were £65.5 million, including a wage bill of £42 million. Amortisation and write-down of players, which we always talk about amortisation, but some people will be new to it. I'll not explain it now, we'll come back to it later, was £26 million. We had made a profit on that sale of Aaron Ramsdale of £11 million. And that gave us overall a trading loss for the year of £13 million. The overall loss after interest ended up being £16 million before tax, and we don't pay tax, so that's the relevant figure basically. So obviously it was, I think we all expected a loss post relegation, but I suppose the key headline here was that if we'd have not sold Aaron Ramsdale, the loss would have been £27 million, which is obviously not the best result in the world.
It's an eye-watering sum for mere mortals like us. But how much did our revenue fall by after relegation?
It's a strange one this way, actually, because obviously we expect the income to drop. We go from having our share of the Premier League money to having a parachute payment, and obviously parachute payments are quite controversial. So our income was still a very healthy £66.9 million, but that was £58 million down on the previous year. Now, I'm going to compare this year against last year, but just to let you know, the previous year was actually an 11-month set of accounts because of COVID adjustments. When I compare this year to last year, I'm going to sort of restate those comparatives on a 12-month basis, so we get a bit more of a fairer comparison. So people don't quite recognise the comparatives to the accounts. That's all I'm doing, really. I'm just making those a 12-month period. So, but interestingly, obviously, if you remember the year before, we had no match day income whatsoever. So although we went from Premier League money to parachute money, the actual match day income was up on the previous year. We generated £7 million of turnover on a match day. We had TV money of just over 50 million, but that was obviously the big difference. The TV money the previous year was 110 million. Sponsorship obviously was affected. So sponsorship was 3.6 million, but we were actually receiving 11 million in the Premier League. So obviously the big hit there. And then we basically earn the rest of it is about £4 or £5 million, which we earn from the ground itself when we hire it out for various events and things like that. So the total of the 66.9 was £58 million down on the previous year. Just to put in context, though, the last time we were in the Championship, before we were actually promoted, our revenue was 20.8 million. So it just shows how much we've actually come on as a club from having those 2 seasons in the Premier League.
Really does. What an impact. Let's talk impact. What impact did parachute payments have on our wage bill?
Yeah, so this is obviously the controversial thing about parachute payments. What clubs that are not in receipt of parachute payments complain about the most is that the teams that get newly relegated or in the second year of relegation and still get a parachute payment, albeit slightly lower. Yeah. They have such a massive revenue advantage over the rest of the league, and that was the case for us. We were actually the second biggest club in the league for revenue, just £2 million behind Fulham and 1 million ahead of West Brom, and we were the 3 obviously relegated clubs. In terms of wages, then that gives you a massive advantage in terms of what you can actually pay in terms of salaries, and obviously the logic is the more you can pay wages, the better players you can get, the more chance you've got of being promoted. Our wages in this year were £42 million, compared to the previous year, which were reported as 56 million. But like I say, if you restate that to 12 months, was 61 million. So it reduced by about £19 million. But actually, I think people were probably surprised it wasn't lower. There was a lot of talk that the players had relegation clauses, and there was a lot of talk that those were as much as 50% pay cuts. If you actually look at it, our wage bill only dropped 30%, and we actually released certain players as well compared to the Premier League. So it probably suggests that the relegation cuts were not as severe in players' contracts as we were led to believe. The interesting thing, though, and coming back to these parachutes, is we were actually the 4th highest payer of salaries in the league. Now, the 3 highest were Fulham with 90 million wage bill, Bournemouth with 61 million, and Nottingham Forest with 58 million. And funnily enough, I don't know if you remember back, but in 21-22, the 3 promoted teams were Fulham, champions, Bournemouth, automatic promoted, and Nottingham Forest, obviously, playoff winner. So the logic that equals performance on the pitch certainly seemed to be borne out in that particular year. And it's probably the reason why 𝗏 actually didn't last very long, because the board presumably thought, well, we've got the 4th highest wage bill in the division. That should give us a good opportunity of promotion. And when 𝗏 left, we were actually lying 16th in the table. And obviously it was after 𝗍𝗍𝗂 came in that we actually saw the value of those players on the pitch.
Well, we won't touch on too much of why it didn't work for 𝗏 on this video, but I think you know my next question, because you've alluded to it there. So did we miss out on promotion because we didn't pay enough in wages, Darren?
Well, on the basis that we were the fourth highest payer and the top three went into the top with the top three, then the facts would say yes. I think that this is where football economics really makes very little sense. To be the accepted spend on wages, the football industry basically says a sensible ratio of spending your revenue on wages is around about the 65% mark. So basically, for every £1 you earn, you pay 65p in wages. That's a sustainable figure. And obviously, with our parachute payments, we were the second highest earner in the league. So in theory, by keeping at a sustainable level, we should have been around about the top 2 or 3 wage payers. Our ratio was 63%, which is like I say, it's very sustainable. And bear in mind, we've just said we would have lost £27 million without selling Ramsdale. So that's even with a wage to income ratio of 63%. But football economics just doesn't seem to make sense in the Championship. So obviously the one that really stands out was Nottingham Forest. They paid more in wages than us, and that's because they actually spent 197% of their revenue on wages. So for every £1 they earned, they actually spent £1.97 on wages. So they were not making any recovery of operating costs or anything else. Fulham and Bournemouth spent 126 and 115%. So basically, they will say they got promoted and the ends justified the means. But you have to be careful. There were other teams that did the same. Preston spent 178% of their revenue. Birmingham 177%, Reading 150%, Blackburn and Cardiff 146%. So for every winner, which was in this case Forest, you've got 4 or 5 that are breaking the bank. And if people look at those clubs that I've just mentioned, they're all in difficulties at the moment. So it really is a case of the balancing act between sensible economics and really going for it and risking it.
So speculate to accumulate. I mean, the Championship as a model is one that we could talk about for hours. And I think you and I would probably be on the same page with how I look at it and unsustainability and long term. But anyway, that's probably for another time. Do the accounts actually reveal the details of that sale that you've now mentioned a few times, Aaron Ramsdale?
They do. This is the first opportunity we've actually had a chance to see whether what was reported was the truth of the matter. So now it looks like Aaron Ramsdale was bought for £18.5 million, which I think was a widely reported figure. Interestingly, though, I suspect there were certain add-ons that were triggered by his sale. So probably the initial amount was actually lower, and the fact we sold him probably triggered some money to Bournemouth as well. And we sold him for £24 million, guaranteed £24 million. Obviously, with a lot of transfers, there are add-ons. But as at June 22, none of those add-ons had actually been triggered. So at that point, we were still at £24 million. So people might look at this and say, well, £24 million less £18.5 million is only £5.5 million profit. We're going to talk about this all the way through, unfortunately. I'll try and keep it as little technical as I can. But basically, when we signed Aaron Ramsdale for the £18.5 million, we don't recognise the full transfer fee in the accounts on day one. We spread that fee over his contract, and this is what we refer to as amortization. Now, we'd actually had a year's worth of play out of him, so we would have actually reduced his value in our accounts by 1 year of his, I think, 4-year contract. So therefore, we actually make a profit on where his value stood after 1 season and not on day one. And that's why we then got in the accounts the £11 million profit per the accounts. So my apologies if I'm losing people here, but obviously amortization is a big part of football transfers, because when you're looking at 25, 30 million pound players, is people probably expect the year they're bought that basically there's 30 million pound expense in the accounts, and it just doesn't work like that. It's spread over the period of their useful value, basically, which is their contract.
It's fascinating. We have spoken about that so many times, and you're right. In football, it's clearly a very, very big part of transfers, and we spent over 100 million on transfers in the Premier League, and Ramsdale apart, we haven't recouped any of this. I mean, what impact does this actually have on our accounts?
Well, this is just going back to what we were talking about, the salaries. On our salaries, we actually spent, I think we spent something like £16 million less on our wage bill than Nottingham Forest. And so people will actually say, well, that's why Forest were promoted and that's why we weren't. But we were paying also for the legacy of these transfers that we paid for in the Premier League. Our amortization, so our spreading of these transfer fees across their contracts, we actually, our amortization was £26 million in this set of accounts. Nottingham Forest was only £7 million. So our actual playing budget was actually £3 million higher than Nottingham Forest. It's just that where Nottingham Forest paid in wages, we were still paying for transfer fees in order to get this squad together, plus the wages that we paid to them. So it wasn't that we were being tighter or we were spending less money than Forest. We were actually spending slightly more, but we'd spent it on transfer fees, where from Nottingham Forest hadn't. So it becomes a complicated puzzle really as to who's spending what and how much you can afford to spend. So, like you say, fundamentally the problem we've had is we spent £105 million in the Premier League. We got £24 million back for Ramsdale. We still had the value of the players like McBurney, Berger, and Brewster, but a lot of those players we didn't get a resale value for. We could have probably reinvested into better wages. And some players we got nothing for. In that season, Luke Freeman went out on loan, and then eventually, obviously, he left for nothing. 𝗵𝗍 went out. Oliver Burke went out. We just didn't recover the value that we paid out in the Premier League, and that legacy, unfortunately, we've suffered from in this first season.
Some lessons hopefully learned. You just listed some transfers there, and shudders. Because it was money that didn't need to be spent. And I think this time round, Sheffield United need to get it right with transfers, as money will be tight. Each one will be crucial. So when we come to transfers, you obviously have to pay agents. What did we pay to agents?
I thought Nick might actually just suddenly appear then for that question, because that's
it's usually his go-to, yeah.
Well, it's not actually disclosed in the accounts, but it is actually disclosed by the Football League. So in that particular season, Sheff United paid £3.5 million to agents, which, when you consider that we actually made no permanent additions to the staff, it's still quite a large figure. Funnily enough, actually, the accounts do show that we paid out an extra £574,000 in transfer fees. So they will actually have been add-ons to old transfers. So we actually did spend just over £500,000 on transfer fees, but they were, again, a legacy of those old deals. But the thing about agents is it's a little bit like signing on fees and transfer fees. When new contracts are signed or when new players are signed, a lot of the agents' fees are spread over the period of the player's contract. So again, these agents' fees will be the agent of John Egan when he signed a new contract, George Baldock, etc., and when people were signed. So that's probably almost the minimum that we would pay with the sort of budgets that we're looking at the moment.
It's really fascinating, that one. Yeah, you're right about that. When you think about not that many incomings, if any. I always try and remain, as we do on Sheff United Way, impartial. And we do get voices in our ears, and we try and take, when we hear a story from someone, we try and then get the right to reply from another party. We always try and do that, and we often do that in the background, and we end up putting the pieces together and getting an idea of where they all sit. And last season we read headlines about unpaid suppliers and obviously the transfer embargo. I've now heard from several different sources about what I now think is the truth behind that. Were there any clues or red flags in these accounts to suggest problems ahead?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, that one. And to be honest, on the face of it, at first viewing, you would say no. So at the end of the 21-22 season, we owed suppliers about £3 million, and we owed the taxman about £5 million. Now, obviously, to you and I, those are big numbers. For a 66 million turnover business, they are actually the sort of normal numbers that you would see in that size of business. They're the sort of bills you're paying your suppliers. So So there's no hint really that we were actually slow to pay our suppliers at that time. It certainly we weren't an outlier compared to other football clubs, let's put it that way. In actual fact, those particular debts were actually lower than what we came down when we were relegated, because we'd actually deferred some of our tax liability due to COVID, which again, most football clubs had taken advantage of, and we'd actually got back into a position where we were on time. The big answer though is, again, it's this legacy of the Premier League. So there was no obvious signs, but if you look a bit deeper, there are some real serious clues and some real red flags. When we were relegated, we owed in transfer fees £36.7 million. So this is putting aside the amortisation. This is purely cash. This is how much we owed on transfer fees to clubs. During that particular year, we paid back just under £10 million. So at the end of June 21, we owed £36.7 million. At the end of June 22, we owed £27 million in transfer fees. So again, a lot of the clubs in the Championship probably weren't in that scenario. Coming in the other way, we were owed £16.75 million by clubs that owed us on transfer fees, and basically that was Ramsdale went for £24 million. We got that money over 3 years, £8 million a year, and we were still owed £16 million at the end of June 22. There was a slightly higher, and I think we were still getting some money from Callum Robinson's transfer the year before, but it's not much. But what you're actually looking at there was, in that particular year, we paid out transfer fees of £9.7 million, and we got in the first instalment of Aaron Ramsdale of £8 million. So basically, they virtually, in football terms, virtually paid for one another. So there was no real issues about actual paying of these transfer instalments. The Ramsdale deal saved us again, basically. But what you've got to bear in mind then is the accounts also disclosed that £27 million that was owed at the end of June 22 was all due, apart from a very small 300 grand, this year. So by last Friday, the whole of that £27 million effectively had to be paid. So whereas the year we're looking at, only 9.7 million actually became repayable, £27 million actually became repayable. And when you then consider that in the second season of relegation, the parachute payment drops by another 10 million, we're in a situation here where we're looking at a reported loss in June 22. There's no real reason why that reported loss would be significantly lower in 23. If anything, it will be higher because we didn't sell any players. The wage bill might be slightly lower, but we kept most of our players. But we've now got to meet a £27 million liability on transfer fees with no money coming in to cover that. And we've also got a £10 million drop in revenue. So suddenly it becomes very clear that those accounts themselves were sort of very much in good working order, but there was problems ahead. And those were the problems that we actually saw and were borne out with the transfer embargo and talk of suppliers that were paid late. So it didn't hit you in the face, but the clues were there, let's put it that way.
Well summarised. I don't know how you do all this, all these numbers. You've looked at these over less than 24 hours. You don't appear to have notes. And they're right there. It baffles me. But apart, go on. You have your right to respond.
No, they were published at 4 o'clock yesterday. What else can you do in?
You're right. That's less than 24 hours at the time we are recording this. Not when you'll be watching it. So let's talk about, apart from transfer debt, do we have any other financial debts?
Yeah, so basically what we have at the moment then is, obviously, putting aside playing staff, we obviously, when the ownership struggle went through the court, obviously it was deemed that Prince Abdullah had to purchase the assets of the club, which effectively are the ground, training facility, and yes, the hotel is an asset according to the account. So, and at that time, the value that was placed on those assets was £42 million. And this is a question I'm constantly asked, actually. What actually happened was the Prince actually didn't purchase those assets himself, the club did. So they actually became club assets, whereas numerous years they've been held outside the accounts by 𝗵𝗿𝗄𝗂𝗃. And there are two sides to this one as to whether the Prince should have bought these assets and then sort of effectively rented them to the club, or whether the club, which needed to borrow money to buy these assets, should buy them directly. Now, it's interesting that these accounts suggest the way we did it, which was the club buying the assets, was actually the right way around. Because during the year, those assets were revalued by independent valuers. And the independent valuers said that where we'd paid 42 million for them, they were now worth 51 million pounds. So by doing it the way we did it, actually the 9 million uplift in value was actually belongs to the club and not Prince Abdullah personally. If obviously he'd owned those assets personally, he would have seen the benefit of that, but he would have still been renting, the club would have still been renting those assets at exactly the same value. So, and what we actually did, we took advantage of that. So basically we came into the season with a 30 million pound loan on those assets. By the end of the season, we owed 40.5 million pounds on those assets. So again, it sounds like a big number, but 40.5 million pounds on assets worth 51 million pounds. It's basically an 80% mortgage, or no, yeah. So it depends on your attitude to debt and mortgage in the similar way it is on your house. So what we did was we used that money in order to fund these working capital losses that we incurred. The alternative would have been either for the owner to put some more money in, which obviously some people would argue he should, or we ran with a lower value playing squad or sold players. But obviously, as we've seen before, if you don't spend your money on the wages, then obviously you can miss out compared to other clubs that are prepared to pay on wages.
And how much interest do we pay on these debts?
So that's 40 million loan. Effectively, we incurred 3 million pounds of interest, which equates to about 7.5% interest. So it's a little bit higher than what are probably commercial rates, because we have to go to people like Macquarie and things like that, who are not probably mainstream bankers. The mainstream banking doesn't really like football for obvious reasons. But again, I think that's a manageable number for the size of business that we are.
I mean, fans often talk about paying for United World. How much did we pay to United World from these accounts?
Yeah, another one that I often get asked a lot on my Twitter. So basically, in that particular year, we paid £1,525,000 to United World, and that's described as consultancy fees. So a lot of fans will say, well, why do we pay that? It's just a waste of money. Why are we funding 𝗍𝗫𝗀 and 𝗍𝗫𝗀 and et cetera, et cetera? What the fans really need to recognise is what's actually paying is the United World are actually the entity that has all the recruitment assets and resources. So basically, United World are the ones that have all the data analysis on all the clubs. They have these worldwide scouting networks. They have employees that work directly for United World. So there are data analysts that work for Sheffield United who tend to deal with opposition analysis and things like that. But all the recruitment is within United World. The logic is that there's a sort of a saving in economies of scale that we've got the same amount of data. We can find a player for Sheffield United. We can find a player not suited to Sheffield United, but maybe will do in the future. Or maybe it's just the one that we sign with a view to resale because they do well for 𝗵𝗿𝗄𝗃. So in theory, if Sheffield United bought this for themselves, the fees of this and the employment costs of all this would actually be higher rather than lower. So it's not a case of do we spend it with United World or nothing. It's if we didn't have this resource from United World, how much would it cost internally? So I think that's the bit that fans struggle to get their head around, really, because there are also other expenses that we share. So we share our insurance costs. Our accounts have no fees or salaries to directors, but obviously there's directors' expenses and our board of directors that need paying for as well. So I think it's just it's an unfortunate circumstance that if you don't like the multi-club model, you'll pick up on this number. But in reality, we would incur this cost, if not more, if that United World concept wasn't around. on that one though, what is important to know is that was the fees that went out. Actually, because of our money problems, United World actually lent the club £6 million during the year on an interest. So even if you're not a fan of the relationship, in this particular year, actually, instead of this, why do we give all this money to United World and all these clubs? Actually, in this particular year, we were a net benefactor of about £4.5 million. So United World actually bailed us out rather than the other way around.
But I think for a lot of fans, the way that they'll look at United World is until Sheffield United see a player that has been signed by, let's say, 𝗵𝗿𝗱𝗶𝗶 as a youngster, and then comes as a signing for Sheffield United and does well, there won't be a tremendous amount of interest in those clubs and that model. That's just from some fans. I'm not talking for everyone, but thank you for explaining that. So overall, should fans be concerned about these accounts? Will they impact on the current season?
Like I say, if we'd have bounced back at the first attempt, these were actually quite a decent set of solid accounts. I know people might say, well, how can we make this sort of loss and say that? But if you actually take the whole, the 2 years in the Premier League and the 1 season in the Championship with Parachute, we would have actually made an overall profit of about £13 million. And a transfer debt of £27 million and a financial debt of £40 million are not numbers that would strike fear into a Premier League club with Premier League money. I think not bouncing back changed that picture entirely, and that's what we'll actually see in next year's accounts, and that's why we, as we touched on before, we struggled with working capital and cash flow. We obviously will face another considerable drop in TV income. We maintained a big wage bill. We didn't sell any players. The obvious solution after this set of accounts, after we hadn't been promoted, would have been that the accountant and the bank manager would have insisted that you sell one of our assets. And that, again, was probably why there was so much noise around Sander Berge during that window. And 𝗍𝗓 at the time probably wasn't as developed as a player as he's probably in the shadow of Morgan Gibbs-White in that year rather than what we've seen since. So there was probably less noise around him at the time. So it was sort of a steady set of accounts, but still there was this shadow that we were going to be back in the Championship the following season. Effectively, as we now know, we threw the dice, we rolled the dice, and unfortunately we rolled a 6. But it was obviously it was hard work and stressful during the time, and you could argue it was unfair on some of our day-to-day suppliers that we strung them out in order to do that. Now we've actually gone back up at the second attempt. I don't think anything in these accounts have particularly got much of a legacy on where we are now as a Premier League club. We didn't sign any players, so there was no legacy of transfer fees. The wage bill is high for a Championship club, but not for a Premier League club. I think the biggest legacy actually will be attitude. I think knowing what we did last time, it'll be sort of once bitten, twice shy when it comes to spending on transfer fees. Instead of we probably adopted the attitude that if we spend 40 million in the window when we were newly promoted and another 20 million in the January, if the worst came to the worst, we would sell those players. And we've probably now found it's a lot easier said than done. So I suspect there'll be a lot more deals that are more to do with, which will be more loans with options to purchase or maybe obligations to purchase if we stay up, and probably a lot less committed up front that we then have to manage if we then go back down again. So I think there may be a change in attitude, but there's nothing in particular in these accounts that really sort of will hang over us to say we need to pay this back or we need to pay that back.
Fascinating. Our annual accounts debrief on the channel with accountant Darren Smith. It's always so useful getting someone who, like you, knows accounts, because that's your bread and butter. For me, it's very, very confusing. But thank you. You've made it manageable in those bite-sized ways that you deliver it. We cannot thank you enough. Until next time.
Yes, no, thank you very much. And I look forward to this time next year for my annual appearance.
Thank you, Darren.